Okay, class, this is chapter 1, part 9, long chapter. Alright, so now we're going to talk about how to find primary sources of law. And we talked earlier in, I think it was in our first video, about citations, and I showed you what citations look like. And a citation is a reference to a publication in which legal authority can be found. Think of it as an address. And because it's like an address, remember we talked about, for example, a Supreme Court case might be, the citation might be Brown versus Board of Education, 195 U.S. 355, 195 being the volume, 355 being the page, and U.S. being the reporter, the books that it's found in. Okay, now, because these cases or statutes can be found in various different publications, we have to have a uniform system so that we all go to the same address. Think of it this way, okay? If somebody told you to go to 1020 Southwest 8th Street, and the streets that you were going to were not numbered, but instead named, so it wasn't 8th Street, but it was Main Street, you might get lost. So we have to have something that tells us that we have to use either like names like Main Street or numbers like 8th Street. And that's just a rough example of what I'm talking about in terms of having a uniform system of finding a citation or an address. So two systems have developed. One is called the Uniform System of Citation, which is the oldest system, and it was developed by the authors or by the editors of the law reviews of some of the Ivy League law schools. It is often called the Blue Book because its cover is blue, and it's sometimes referred to for some reason as the Harvard Blue Book. The next one is called ALWED, which is the acronym for Association of Legal Writing Directors, Guide to Legal Citation. And I'm going to make this short because it's not something you need to know, but just so to explain why there's two systems. This system was supposed to be developed to simplify what became a very complicated system when the Uniform System of Citation got into like its 13th or 14th edition and grew from this tiny book to this thick book. Unfortunately, it probably hasn't completely done what it was supposed to do. But in some ways, I guess people would argue it's better. So some schools, some lawyers, some judges use one system, some use the other system. Basically, about 95-98%, they are the same. They will tell you the same citation. And there's actually an article that was written that tells you where the differences are. This is something that really comes into play only if you're writing or researching for a court or another lawyer. So for most of your purposes as a business law class, it really isn't extremely important. Okay, so where do you find constitutions? Constitutions can be found simply by Googling, like so many things can be found today. They're also in alone types of pamphlets or books. Also, we mentioned before that state statutes are placed in books that we call codes. They're codified. The federal ones are in U.S. Code Annotated, U.S. Code Service, those books, and they will contain the United States Constitution as well. So will your state codes. They will also have your state constitution and the United States Constitution. Those constitutions, which are the same content, are actually a little bit more helpful because they will refer you to cases that explain or that have dealt with the particular provisions of the Constitution. So if you want to do some in-depth research, like how have the courts treated the Second Amendment, you would probably be better off going to one of the codes and looking at the Constitution there than you would finding it online or in a textbook like your textbook, which has the U.S. Constitution. So we talked about that. All right, statutes, as I said, when Congress or a legislator passes a law, it's in a form that is very comprehensive, and for practical purposes in the law, is not very useful. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole process by which it's published, etc. It's in your book, but the bottom line is it's not very useful. So those statutes are taken and they're put in books called codes, and we call that process codification. And we take those statutes and we put them by topic. Okay, so for example, in Georgia, a title is a topic. So Title 19 of the Georgia Code has to do with family law. It's topical. Okay, Title 42 in the United States Code, the U.S. statutes, has to do with, I believe, health and welfare, civil rights, those kind of things. And so again, it's topical. Okay, so that helps to do research, and it also means that it's timely, because as the legislator changes those laws or amends them, the code is amended. We don't have to look at every single law that was passed by Congress and add them all together or compile them all together. It's done for us in the codification process. So this explains it and explains how it works. So what you want to do, again, is find primary law. So for statutes, it's going to appear in the codes, and with the federal code, it's going to be the official code is the United States Code. I'm not even sure where you can find that, okay, because nobody uses it. The unofficial codes, which have the same exact statutes in it, are primarily the United States Code Annotated, which is a publication that used to be by West, who's now been bought out by somebody else. And the other one is the United States Code Service, which used to be lawyers. I'm not remembering what it was, but now I think it's owned by Lexis. But at any rate, those are the two primary sources for the U.S. Code, other than electronic sources. So electronic sources are multiple ones. You can find them on commercial services, and you can find them by Googling, etc. Okay, so as I said, those are the two main sources of the U.S. statutes, and you can also go online to www.gpo.gov. They are good because they contain not only the statutes, as I said, but editorial material, such as the legislative histories of those provisions and annotations. What are annotations? They are notes. Primarily, they are cases and the citations to those cases that have addressed those particular statutes. So it's a very useful way of getting started in your research, and it'll have a note. For example, under the let's say the Title 19 of the Georgia Code, where it talks about, it says only the mother of a child born out of wedlock has legal rights to that child. Under that provision, it might have a case note, an annotation that would be titled something like exceptions or something, and it might say exception is where the father has legitimated the child through a court proceeding, and you want to read that case and want to read how it's applied. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, now administrative law. Administrative law is very difficult sometimes to research. In fact, for businesses, I would suggest that oftentimes what you're going to want to do is read a secondary source, like a encyclopedia, treatise, or in most businesses' cases, I would suggest that most businesses have what are called trade magazines. And oftentimes those trade magazines will have articles dealing with the subject that you are involved in, and will give you references to those administrative rules or regulations. But the administrative regulations at the federal level are issued by agencies and published in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is pretty much useless to most of us, except lawyers who follow it, usually for trade organizations or for particular groups. But at any rate, let's move beyond that because it's not particularly useful to you. Eventually, it's codified, just like statutes are, in the Code of Federal Regulations, the federal regulations, which is available in print and online. In print, it's not particularly useful unless you have a secondary source telling you where to go, and that's primarily because there's not a very useful index or table of contents that's helpful in that situation. So it's much better, if you can, to go online for federal regulations, and in that situation you may be able to use your search tool within your electronic research process. Okay. In Georgia, administrative rules are issued by the agencies, and then it's the responsibility of the Secretary of State to post those on the Secretary of State's web page. In addition to that, each individual agency is supposed to post their regulations on their web page. So in Georgia, you really, your almost only option is electronic, which isn't a bad thing. It's actually much easier. And you would want to look at the Secretary of State's web page and the agency's web page. So we're going to stop there with Part 9. Again, for Chapter 1, the magic word is federalism.